need something louder. So my dad went out in the back alley, grabbed a cement-soaked piece of plywood, brought it in. Pat Conley grabbed it and broke it over the microphone and recorded it. And we said, well, that sounds like a busting surfboard.
Yeah.
Because we were surfers, and we all surfed, Pat and I especially.
There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day. There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, and tomorrow's just a dream away.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another encounter with some groovy moments from the past. We're visiting the 60s with host Dick Scapatoni, whose pop group Harper's Bazaar had a hit record back then called Feelin' Groovy. He'll be talking with our guests about a decade that shaped a whole generation, not only with the most magnificent music ever made, but also the politics, protests, and pretty much everything that happened in the swingin' 60s. So Dick, who's on today's show?
Hey, thanks, John. When I was in high school, there was really only two things I was interested in, surfing and girls, and not in that order. We'd spend our summers on the beach in Santa Cruz from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, and every summer we would make at least one surfing trip, or surf and safari, if you want to call it that, down the coast to Southern California. We went to every surf movie in every civic auditorium between Santa Cruz and Laguna Beach, and it was during those years that I worked for Jack O'Neill, selling surfboards and wetsuits, and listening to some of the best surf music the 60s gave us. Every summer when I was in high school, we used to make our annual trip from Santa Cruz down to Southern California and hit all the surf spots along the way. We'd stop at the Rendezvous Ballroom in Newport Beach to hear Dick Dale and the Deltones, and then on to Laguna Beach High School to hear Bruce Brown in person narrating his surf movies. And there was always those close-up shots of toes hanging 10, backed up by probably the most famous surf song ever recorded, Wipe Out. The band was the Surfaris, and the guitar man was Bob Berryhill, who just happens to be with us today. Hey, Bob, thanks for joining me on America's Oldies But Goodies.
Hey, surf's up right here in Laguna Beach.
Is it really? All right. Now, where are you? Are you in Laguna Beach?
I'm in Laguna Beach.
Oh, my God. All right.
Yeah, right, home of the Bruce Brown movies. Saw them there many times.
Do you know that we'd come down, as I said, every summer, and we would go to what I think was Laguna Beach High School at that time. And I have a friend who now lives in Laguna Beach. I visited him one time, and when I was visiting him, I told him about many years ago how we used to go to the surf movies. He said, well, let's drive by and see if the place looked the same. Well, it did look the same to me as you came up the hill. The very first building in that high school complex was where I believe I used to go to see Bruce Brown.
Yeah, he would play in the gymnasiums, the various auditoriums, because we grew up in Glendora, my wife and I, and the Surfaris.
Yeah.
And he would bring his movies to our gymnasium and show them with a soundtrack, and it would always be surf music, of course, so it was a great experience because we really hadn't had anybody. There wasn't any short movies really about anything. I mean, I used to watch the programs on TV that had skiing, snow skiing, and then some water skiing, but surfing was kind of always relegated to the movie at the school gym.
Right.
Really didn't have any surfing on TV back then.
They were very basic, and we used to see them regularly in Santa Cruz at the Civic Auditorium in Santa Cruz. Let's just go back before the Wipeout time frame and just kind of bring everybody up to speed, basically where you started. Were you born in Southern California?
Yeah, I was born in Covina, California.
Okay.
I grew up in Glendora, which is a little town north of Covina, a few miles, and they call it a bedroom community now. But back then it was orange groves.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
It was an orange growing. They had packing houses along the railroad track, and my family was into orchard maintenance, doing spraying and picking and handling orchards and doing construction and things like that. And so I kind of grew up in a orange packing construction family that enjoyed living in Glendora.
Did you surf as a kid?
Well, what happened was that's kind of the whole thing with my life has been kind of one of those great things that have happened to a kid that had no purpose in it happening, but it did. I actually, in 1960, when just after they started flying the 707 jets to Hawaii, my mom and dad, because they were very successful business people, my dad was a contractor, and they were building like track houses all over San Gabriel Valley. My dad was involved with all of that. Anyway, he made a lot of money, so we took myself, my older sister, and my mom, and we all went to Hawaii. And so I had the luxury of learning to surf from a real beach boy.
Yeah, wow.
Right on Waikiki Beach. I started when I was 13, 1960, and went out there and just fell in love with surfing.
Had to be heavenly, and I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He had a band that was on TV. Well, it's not rock and roll. This was Hawaiian music. Harry Owens, or... Well,
Harry Owens, yeah, he did Hawaiian. There was all kinds. It was the Leakey Brothers, the Lackey Trio, I think they were called. I mean, back when Hilo Hattie was actually doing the hula.
That's right.
She had a whole hula thing, and this was before 1960. I mean, it was the main drag in Waikiki Beach. There was a two-way highway, and parked along there with surfboards in your car, and you could hang out at Waikiki Beach. And there wasn't the only big hotel was the Ala Moana, and then the Kaiser Hawaiian Village down the way where they do all the Hawaii Five-0 filming and stuff. So I got to go out and go surfing right there, my sister and I. So we got taught how to surf. I just fell in love with it because it was freedom. You know, I mean, I learned to water ski because my dad had ski boats, and we go down to Newport Bay and Back Bay and Balboa area and water ski. But I finally got to go surfing, and when I was 13, I said, wow, this is for me. And so for the next 50 years, I surfed regularly.
Yeah, that's great. That is great. So you managed to stick with it for a while. After I got out of high school, as much as I loved surfing, and we would carry our surfboards on our heads and walk down to the beach in Santa Cruz, which was probably about a 1.5 mile walk from up on the hill where we lived. So we were pretty heavy-duty surfers, but I got out of it, and I've never really gotten back into it. I kind of, what I miss is the water and the smell of the ocean.
Yeah, well, that's something my wife and I fell in love with when we were teenagers. Because our first date was at Doheny Beach.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So surfing. She had a green surfboard, and I had a surfboard, and we went down there together and been surfing ever since.
Do you remember about what year that would have been at Doheny? Early 60s?
1960 through 1966 was great surfing. Great surfing up until they put the harbor in. When they killed Killer Dana, because we used to go surfing at Dana, or they call Killer Dana now. It used to be a big surfing spot. Now it's got a big rock jetty there, and you can't do much with it. But it's good for fishing, but that's about it. But, that was 1960 through about 68 or so.
Okay.
We did a lot of surfing up and down the coast.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if we somehow didn't run into each other down there, because that was, every summer, that's Doheny Beach was our mainstay. That's where we camped, and then we went to all the beaches from there. Well,
if you saw a 57 Chevy four-door turquoise with surf racks on it, that was my wife's. We would drive that from Glendora all the way down with the surf racks were kind of rusted onto the rails on the top, but we got them on there, and the floorboards were full of sand.
Oh, yeah, I'll bet. And that all the old surfing wagons at that time truly were just old surfing wagons.
The car was worth $200 then.
Yeah.
57 Chevy.
Uh-huh.
That's right. And it was she got it for her graduation from high school or something, and her dad had it painted by her brother-in-law in his garage, and it looked nice, but it was just our surf buggy, and we'd cruise up and down there.
Well, I can remember we made our trip down in the summer, and that night camped at Doheny, and the next morning at 6 a.m, we were out on the water at Trestles, and perfect blue sky, no wind, just perfect waves, and so that was paradise back then, just about as paradisey as you can get.
Yeah, well, that whole area down there is still just tons of people surfing out there. Like they have several different areas for longboarders and shortboarders, all from Trestles down to the Marine base there, down in front of the nuclear station down there.
Do the Marines not keep people out anymore? Because it used to be you couldn't go there.
Used to, and it's still kind of restricted, but they kind of let us slide.
Okay.
You get caught once in a while, but not a big deal.
Yeah. Now, did you start playing music in high school?
I started when I was 8 years old.
Okay.
My parents were into what they called Western music in those days. It's called country now.
Sure, yeah, right.
And so they had a lot of friends who were professional musicians that would come through the Glendora area, and they had a lot of friends who played, and they would come over to our house, and when we were just kids, there'd be about 25 of us sitting around our living room all playing guitar, banjo, fiddles, accordions, all kinds of acoustic gear, and then that was when I was about 8 to 10. And then when I went to Hawaii, and when I was 13, that's when I really started to play guitar, because I went to, along with surfing, learning to surf from that point, I also saw a guy playing ukulele, just the most beautiful sort of lead guitar ukulele, more than just strumming. He was playing notes and playing melodies, Hawaiian melodies, and he was about 24 up there, and he looked great, and I told my dad, I want to do that.
Yeah, okay.
So the next morning, at the what was called the Kaiser Hawaiian Village, then went down in the foyer area. It was all open. That's what was so amazing about Hawaii, is there was no doors on the Hawaii hotels, because they were always open because of the trade winds. Anyway, he goes walking across. I recognized him. He walked across the Lanai area there, and I ran up to him. And, I'm only 13, and I grabbed him. I said, I want an ukulele. Can you teach me? And he says, okay. So he took my dad and I downtown to a Kamaka ukulele store and picked a bunch of them off the wall and played them and said, hey, this is a good one. So it was a koa wood ukulele. It was beautiful. And he picked out a book for me to say, okay, you learn to play with this book, and here's your ukulele. And I said, well, how much is it? Oh, $15.
Oh, gee.
To my dad and said, Dad, can I have $15? We're talking 1960.
Yeah.
You asked your dad for $1, you were getting a lot. So anyway, he paid for it because we were on vacation and he couldn't back down. So he bought it, and so I spent that next week. We traveled all over the islands. Those days we called the Cook Tours. And so I got on the airplane, and we'd get into the next hotel, and I'd sit around the lobby and just practice. I just loved it, and just went all over Hawaii playing ukulele and learning Little Brown Jug and all the songs. And then I spent a whole week coming back on the SS Lurleen, which was a cruise ship.
Yes.
And I sat in the lobby and played for a whole week. I mean, there was nothing else to do on cruise ships in those days. It wasn't like today's Disney where you got stretched lines and swimming pools, and this thing had a swimming pool, but it wasn't like the ones they have today. And so I just basically sat inside the foyer of wherever the cocktail room or wherever it was, card room, and played, and it was great.
It sounds like just great memories of the whole Hawaiian scene with the sun and the surf and everything. What a different feel, and as a kid that must have just been spectacular. So at some point you shifted, I'm going to assume, over to electric guitar.
Yeah, well, what happened was I came back to Glendora, and I wanted to find an ukulele teacher at the Glendora Music Store, which is who I had, only music store that was in Glendora anyway. And they said, well, we don't have ukulele, but we can do guitar. I said, well, they both have strings, and I'll just go ahead and I played guitar already from when I was about 8, so I was already used to strumming chords and things. But I said, I really want to learn to read music, and I want to, really get good at lead guitar. I said, okay, well, we have a teacher here. She knows all about it. And so this woman, I think her name was Linda, she was about 20-something, and she had a Stratocaster, a blonde Stratocaster guitar, which I thought, wow, that's awesome. And so I sat there. I was playing my dad's Silvertone acoustic guitar that he had since he was a kid, and she showed me a few licks, and I started learning to read music, and she started teaching me to read charts and chord sheets and lead sheets and things like that. And then I got, I need to get electric, so my dad's friend, Walter Crabtree, used to play a Telecaster. And I said, well, why don't you find me a guitar, because he was really into the buying and selling and stuff. So he brought over about a 1956 blonde Telecaster and a little blonde champ, looks like an amp, a blonde little amp. And I said, well, how much is it? It was $150.
Probably 6,000 right about now.
Yeah, it's about $6,000 today.
Yeah.
And so 150 was like $6,000 then to a kid. But so I said, Dad, I'll pay you back. So my dad forked over the 150, and I got the guitar, and I took lessons for about 2 years, and that's really where I met Jim Fuller, the other guitar player. He was taking lessons from the same teacher.
Okay.
So we both played in the same groups. They had a group lesson sometimes, and we'd all 20 or 30 kids of us would sit around a room, and we'd stand up and play a lead of some type and then sit down. We'd all go around, and so it was kind of a starting point.
And so did you actively think about starting a, quote, band?
Well, I was 13, 14 years old, 15. We were just getting into junior high. So it was basically our 8th grade talent show at Sellers Junior High School. We used to have talent shows every year for the 7th and 8th grades, and I brought my teacher to play backup for me, so I played like Walk, Don't Run or something like that.
Yeah.
And she backed me up, and then Pat and Jim Fuller, that's how I knew Pat because we were in 6th grade together, but I met Pat and Fuller got together, and they said, well, can we borrow your guitars and your amps, because we wanted to play in the contest. And so Jim and Pat got up there, and I'm standing off stage, and they're just like Mutt and Jeff up there. They just couldn't do a thing. And it was like they were trying to play a song together, and, Pat didn't know how to do anything, hardly, but just kind of plunk a little bit. And Fuller was pretty good. And so they were trying to play together, and so they started borrowing. They used my equipment to play through the show, and we did our thing. And then my wife, Jean, she was actually a dancer doing modern dance, so they did it to, like, Hound Dog or something. And so we were all kind of up there together. And at that point, there were other groups that played, had groups of guys playing. And so from that point on, they saw I had equipment, so everybody wanted to go over to my house and rehearse. So I had lots of guys coming over and playing from that point on.
Hey, do you feel a song coming on? I do. Let's take a break, just enough time for a quick cappuccino, and we'll return shortly.
She acts sort of teenage, just in between age, looks about 4'3". Although she's just small fry, just about so high, Gidget is the one for me. A regular tomboy, but dressed for a prom. Boy, how cute can one girl be? Although she's not king size, her finger is ring size, Gidget is the one for me. If she says she loves you, you can bet your boots she loves you.
Now, take us to Wipeout. How did that whole thing come about?
Well, it's one of those situations where in Glendora, it was a pretty limited group of guys, but we would go around, hang around each other and play music, and I had good friends who were that played. And then one day, Jim Fuller, this is September of 1962. Okay, we're sophomores in high school, and we're all 15 years old. And Jim Fuller and Pat Conley called me up on the phone and said, "Hey, Bob, can we come over and practice?" It's on a Saturday. And I said, "Well, sure. We've done other things like that before." So they came over, and we practiced for about 2 or 3 hours. I played all the songs I knew, and Fuller played all that he knew, and Conley would sit there and play on my Telecaster because he didn't have a guitar. Fuller had a little dual sonic Fender, and I had my Jazzmaster at that point. I'd bought a new Jazzmaster because I was moving up I was doing my own recitals and things, and that's what I wanted to look better, so I bought the Jazzmaster and Fender Jazzmaster. Anyway, they came over, and after about 3 hours of practice, Pat Conley says, "Hey, Bob, I've got a gig for us tonight. Do you want to play?" I went, "Well, sure." He said, "Where at?" "Well, it's going to be at Pomona Catholic High School. It's going to be after a football game. We're going to play a sock hop," as we used to call them in those days. And I said, "Sure." So I said, "Well, we don't have a drummer." And Pat goes, "Well, we're going to meet the drummer there."
Okay.
So, I said, "Well, sure, why not? I'm game," because I'm always game for things like that. So we packed all of my stuff. I had a Fender Bandmaster with two 12-inch speakers and 4 places to plug guitars into, and put my equipment in the back of my mom's 61 Cadillac, pink Cadillac she had. And she and my dad drove us to Pomona Catholic High School. And so we got to the high school, and sure enough, there's Ron Wilson, the drummer of Wipeout, setting up his drums under the basketball hoop. And there's a bunch of kids around playing, decorating the place and getting ready. So we plugged in and started playing, and then the football game got over, and all the kids showed up, and they really liked the sound we had. Everybody was dancing and having a good time. And so Fuller and Pat and I said, "Well, Ronnie, why don't we form a band?" So they said, "Okay." I said, "Well, we need a manager," because I knew that if you didn't have at least management, you weren't doing anything. They said, "Well, we know Dale Smallin." And I said, "Well, I know him as well. He was my Boy Scout
leader,
master.
Yeah, Scoutmaster, okay.
Scoutmaster. And so they said, "Okay, well, let's go over to his place." So we started practicing at his photography studio. He used to make documentary films like Bicycle Safety, which I was in one when I was in 6th grade, and he was the producer of the movie. And so was Pat Conley and I, because we were at 6th grade at Gordon Elementary together. And so, anyway, I knew Dale, and so we started rehearsing, and then after we rehearsed 2 or 3 times, Dale got us a job at the Teen Center in Azusa. So we played there, and it sounded good. And then one night in, the next month or 2, Ronnie came up to me and said, "Hey, had a dream about a song called Surfer Joe." And so I said, "Cool, let me put some chords to it." So what do you do when you're 15? You put the most primitive chord progression you can behind it. So I put that chord progression, and we started practicing that. And when we got it all done, our manager, Dale, said, "Hey, that's a good song. It sounds kind of Beach Boyish. Why don't we go and record it?" So anyway, we think, well, okay, we're going to go to Hollywood to record, because that's where the studios were.
Yeah.
He says, no, we're going to a place. It's really cool. It's out in Cucamonga. How many people go to Cucamonga?
Okay, right, yeah.
It sounds like a joke, but that was a real town. It's now called Rancho Cucamonga, which is a big area out east of Los Angeles where everybody moved to during the 80s to buy cheap housing. And so anyway, here's this old town. It was basically a ghost town. And so what we did is everybody showed up at my driveway. There was Ron Wilson, Pat Conley, Jim Fuller, and Bob Berryhill, and myself. We were standing there in the driveway, and Dale pulls in his I think it was a 59 Chrysler Imperial, big blue thing with big fins on it, pulls up in my yard, and we're all standing out there, and my Uncle Don is there, and my dad, and Dale goes, "Okay, where's the $150?
Oh, I see.
Everybody opened, Pat and Jim and Ronnie, naturally, they didn't have any money. And they all looked at me and as the money pocket. So I said, "Well, let me go ask my mom." So I went in the house and said, "Mom, I need a check for $150. Again, that's a lot of money in 1962. Major stuff, because I said, "Well, I'll pay you back." And so I got back outside and said, "Guys, you have to pay us back, but my mom's going to write a check." So she gave me a check, and we all got in our cars. I had rebuilt a 1956 Ford pickup truck at that point, everything but the paint job. And so I did the engine, trans, and all that. So I put all the equipment in the back of my truck, and my dad had to drive with me because I only had a learner's permit. I'm 15 and a half at this point. So we drove to Cucamonga, and we pulled up in front, and I'm going, "Wow, is this really the place?" And so we opened the door, and the door opens like Inner Sanctum, the squeaky door.
Yeah,
and
right.
here is this blacked-out studio in there that Paul Buff, who later years, his studio was quite famous. Frank Zappa actually bought the studio later on.
Really, that same studio in that location?
Same studio, same place. Anyway, so Paul Buff was a Marine who had learned electronics in the Marine Corps and built his own studio. And so he sort of became the father of surf music because of recording, because he was the cheapest place and he knew how to make it sound good. He was like a third, sort of like the fifth Beatle, It's kind of like the producer. He knew how to position equipment in his room and make you sound good. We put my amp in there, Ronnie's drums, and another amp, and then we said, well, what are we going to do with the bass? Well, the bass is going direct. Well, we'd never heard that before. And in fact, but I said, well, we don't even have a bass, and Pat says, well, hang on, I got a bass. So the first night Pat Conley ever played the bass guitar was the night he played Wipeout.
Really?
He brought in a harmony bass that he borrowed from his cousin, from a Sears harmony bass. He plugged it in direct, and then we started playing, did a couple of songs to kind of warm up, and then they said, okay, well, let's do Surfer Joe. So we recorded. We got through and I did the chord progression, and we worked out parts, and we got Surfer Joe recorded, and then Ronnie got up and did the overdub the voice, because that's what you did in those days. And he sang that, and the mic was set up there, and we were all done, and they said, hey, Paul Buff gets on the talkback button, the little button, behind the window of the studio. He goes, boys, you need a second song for your 45. And I go, well, we haven't written another song. He says, well, okay, the option is we can take and put Surfer Joe on both sides of your 45, or you can write another song right now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You go, Ronnie starts playing a drum cadence, that cadence that's on Wipeout. He starts playing that, and he just hits it, and I started going, well, we better put some chords and a melody, bass line, or this is going to be it's going to be a drum solo. And so I put these chord breaks in it, because I love to play grand bar chords, and we started putting, Pat Conley goes da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, and Fuller goes da-da-da-da-da-da-da with the lead. And we, after first take, he said, that's pretty good, try it again. So we did it a second time, and they said, well, okay, let's do it one more time. And so I had to kind of add the breaks and the arrangement to it, and said, okay, third time through, we recorded it, and we got the song done.
And that was it. Amazing. What I'm guessing he must have had some kind of a live echo chamber somewhere in that building.
Well, like I say, he was like an instrument. He had made everything himself. He did have a recording plate. I believe it was on the roof. One of those things that were designed, he bought somewhere or made it himself, but it wasn't a spring reverb. It was what they call a plate reverb, I believe. Mm-hmm. That was in there. But he had a mono studio where he did you could do stereo, but we didn't have the money. So we did it mono. And so it came out with one track, you know what I mean, at the end. And so he recorded that, and then he says, well, what do you want to call this thing? And Jim Fuller happened to have a switchblade in his pocket because he'd been to Tijuana the weekend before.
Oh,
and he goes up to the microphone and he clicks it.
Yeah.
And so and Paul goes, well, that ain't good enough. We need something louder. So my dad went out in the back alley, grabbed a cement-soaked piece of plywood, brought it in. Pat Conley grabbed it and broke it over the microphone and recorded it. And we said, well, that sounds like a busting surfboard.
Yeah.
Because we were surfers, and we all surfed, Pat and I especially. And so Pat and those guys started talking, and I said, well, why don't we have it like Goofy Going Over the Falls? And so Dale Smallman comes out of the rehearsal, out of the talkback room, anyway, the studio, comes up to the microphone and goes, ha, 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 Wipeout. Just like that, out of the blue. And they tuck on so we got the Wipeout laugh, we got the crack, and Wipeout becomes the theme of the song.
Amazing.
And then 2 weeks later, we had a 45.
That's like what you'd see in a movie.
It's the story of That Thing You Do.
Yeah.
You just show up, and that's why everybody calls it a fluke. Well, it's kind of like your best efforts. You all put it together, and it works. And that's kind of the way the Surfaris always worked, because from then on, whenever we Well, we got on the Dot Records, and let's see, that's basically somewhere around December of 62, and by April of 63, it was number one in Los Angeles. And then by July, it was number one in the United States, or number two, depending on which chart you looked at. And then by August, September, it had traveled all the way around the world.
That's just amazing.
Japan, Australia, Germany, Europe, Asia, all over.
So one of those songs was the A-side, and was Surfer Joe like the B-side?
Well, Surfer Joe was initially the A-side because that's the reason we went to the studio. But, you know, it's like anything else. A 45 has two sides. And so when Wipeout becomes a hit, the B-side becomes a hit as well, although you don't hear it because the writer of it gets paid as if he was on both sides.
Sure, yeah.
So Ronnie had songwriter. I thought we'd give Ronnie the whole Surfer Joe because it was his idea, although I put the music to it. But, hey, you know, in those days we weren't splitting things up. But it was a situation where, you know, when you have the Surfaris, I was going to say, is that when we were on Dot, we went to record our album, and then when we had to go through a lawsuit. I don't know if you've heard of all that.
No, I didn't.
No? Well, I can go over that. But then when we got on to Decca, from that point on, from about September of 1963 on, we were on Decca Records. And Decca allowed us to do the same thing. We would just show up at the studio, and we would play. It's what our first album was called, The Surfaris Play, because we would just start playing, and we would play a song that we liked to play on our concert series. Then we'd say, hey, that sounds good. Let's try this. And we start up another song, and it would be an original song. You know, so we did things like Point Panic and Scatter Shield and Dune Buggy, Burning Rubber, Hot Rod Graveyard. All the songs that the Surfaris did originally were always wrote in the studio.
That's amazing.
At the time. We never brought a song in and said, hey, listen to this. Other than Ronnie, he'd be the only one who would bring one in, and it was always a vocal. So whatever he had for vocals, it was original vocals. He would write it at home, you know, on a piece of newspaper or an envelope or something and bring it in and set it up and start singing it, and then we'd have to put the music to it.
So do you remember what studio? You must have been in a studio in Hollywood at that point.
Yeah, when we got on to Decca, we went to United and Gold Star.
Western is right up the street from United.
Yeah, United, and there was another one on that street. All of those studios, and what was great about that is there were guys like Hal Blaine. His drums would be in the studio, or Glenn Campbell would be in the studio, and all the guys who were the sort of the wrecking crew guys. They were all around us, you know, and they would come in and out of the studio looking at us, and there we are, just a bunch of snotty-nosed 16-year-olds,
yeah,
just playing noise. We just made noise, you know, compared to those guys. Well, the word garage band had not been famed, but we were definitely the quintessential garage band.
Okay, yeah. It sounds like it. We had, Harper's, somewhat to our chagrin, and I'll explain why in a minute. We used the Wrecking Crew on everything that we recorded. We used them because that's what Warner said we had to do, and we were fine with that, and they were fabulous musicians, no problem there. But we did reach a point, I want to say along about maybe the fourth album, where we said we want to play our own instruments, because we never played any instruments in the studio, and they finally relented and at that point and let us play our own. But the Feelin' Groovy thing, that was all Wrecking Crew people that did that.
Yeah, Feelin' Groovy and those kind of songs were very much the sort of the formula that the major record labels kind of really wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of what happened to us. We finally had to succumb to formulas like that because Decca was wanting more and more albums. We had 6 albums. I think we did 8 albums in total as the Surfaris, but they wanted that kind of stuff as well.
Let's take a brief moment to listen to a familiar tune. We'll be right back.
Every night I sit here by my window, staring at lonely avenue, watching lovers holding hands and laughing, and thinking about the things we used to do.
Thinking of things
like a walk in the park, like a kiss in the dark, like a sailboat ride. What about the night we cried? Things like a lover's vow, things that we don't do now. Thinking about the things we used to do.
Let's talk about, and I think I probably already know the answer because I think we've been talking about it, but I'll ask you anyway. What do you consider to be among your most notable successes?
Obviously, Wipeout has been, it sort of started things off, but that's one of those things where right out of the bag you are famous. I mean, you go from being a country bumpkin in Glendora, hayseed they used to call us, and suddenly I'm playing the Hollywood Bowl. And we're only 15 and 16. So the mental state of a 16-year-old is nothing compared to a 24-year-old. And everybody we would play with, all of the musicians, all the guys, were always in their 20s. You know, we had the Righteous Brothers would show up and want us to back them up at the Cinnamon Sender up in Fresno. That was our first away gig. You know, here we are, 16-year-old, and we're going to back up the Righteous Brothers. You know, and now this is before they had their big hits with Phil Spector, but they had Little Nat and Loopy Loo.
Sure,
that's just a little da-da-da-da-da. You know, we could do this, you know. But they would put charts out there and say, okay, play these charts, and you know, our guys would look at that and go, what's a chart? You know, I mean, I knew what it was because, like I say, I knew how to read music, so I could say, okay, this is the chord progression. And then we were playing with Bobby Vinton in Hawaii, and he laid out one, and it had an F-sharp minor in it. And we're playing along his song, and that F-sharp minor comes up, and we're just sitting in the bedroom, right, at the hotel room going over the charts, and everybody misses the chord, naturally. And he just blows a gasket. He goes, I can never find anybody who can read those songs. I went, hey, guy, we're only 16. What do you expect, you know? And so it was. We learned our lessons the hard way. We kind of bit the bullet on a lot of that. But that we used to be hired as the backup band to back up the Shirelles or Eddie Hodges or, you know, things like that. And you know, it's kind of like, wow, that's learning the hard way.
Oh, know? It is learning the hard way, and particularly if you're playing by ear, which most of us, not you, but most of us, myself included, always just played by ear. So if you put a chart in front of me, I wouldn't have a clue what was going on. You mentioned some well-known people. Talk about some of the well-known people you worked with back in those days.
Okay, well, we started out, like I say, basically William Morris Agency was booking us to do a lot of, we went to Hawaii and played at the Blaisdell Auditorium and sold it out. We played with, like I say, Bobby Vinton, played with Eddie Hodges, the Crystals. In fact, I just saw the Beach Boys, Roy Orbison, Paul and Paula, Neil Sedaka, a lot of the doo-wop groups. When we did TV shows, we would meet them, Anthony and the Imperials, the Tokens. In other words, there was always, when you're as young as we were, we didn't know at the time, but there's a lot of groups that are going down in popularity as you're going up in popularity. Well, when you're going down in popularity, there's groups coming up in popularity.
Right.
You know, so you're always making crosses of that in various ways. We've, we played with Jay and the Americans. We played with Dee Dee Sharp, all kinds of groups that in those days, I mean, we didn't know one from the other. They were coming from back east. Just about everybody who played on the bandstand back in Philadelphia would come out and be on the TV shows in California.
I assume back in the early 60s, I could be wrong, I don't know if this is a fact, but I assume that surfing was pretty much exclusively a West Coast and Hawaii kind of thing. I don't know that it was a big deal in Philadelphia.
It's like any other fad, you know, when it hits, especially with the beach party movies.
Yes, that's right.
We just played 2 weeks ago at the Cerritos Performing Arts Center down here in Cerritos with Frankie Avalon.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He has a touring band, and we got on the stage with him, and after we played, we were talking to him. He said, yeah, the beach party movies. I mean, he even shows clips of the beach party movies with Annette and all that stuff, and then he plays Wipeout in the middle of his set.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so anyway, talking to him about it, and he said, people, he was in Philadelphia, right? He says people would be driving around with surfboards on their cars because of the beach movies. There were people like in New Jersey that were finding surf spots.
Amazing.
Along the coast. You can still find them to this day. There are guys on the East Coast that actually surf. Certain times of the year, waves come into some of those ports back on the East Coast, and So their guys actually were surfing, but obviously the people were wearing baggy pants and huaraches and sandals and all those kind of things that were. And you got to remember that surf, and another whole industry that started with surf clothes. There were Hang 10, which sponsored us for a while. They would send their clothes to back east, and people were wearing baggies and those kind of Hawaiian shirts and things. So it's kind of like the Fender guitar industry blossomed during that time. The clothing industry, the surfboard industry, and then the music industry was all, and Hollywood. We were all kind of growing on this big wave together.
Yeah, same thing. I worked for Jack O'Neill selling boards for him when I was first year in college. I was 18. I sold wetsuits just as he was starting to make them.
Yeah.
And, of course, at that same time, I've gotten into more than a few arguments with people about skateboards, but I contend that skateboards, we started them here in Santa Cruz. I could be wrong. Everybody probably claims that. But I remember actually taking skates apart, the old-style skates, and hammering them onto a 2x4.
Did the same thing.
Did you? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, my wife and I, all her friends and I friends, we had boards that we would 2x4s. We would take those wonderful. My mom and dad had those black and white leather skates. We'd literally hacksaw them apart and nail them on the front, on the back of a piece of 2x4, and wear the heck out of them. Those nice rubber rollers that used to go on for the roller rinks. Those things would wear out fast, but boy, they could turn a corner.
Well, you know what? Speaking of turn a corner, I'm going to turn this around a little bit. In spite of all of our successes, most of us know that life is not all a bed of roses. What's your best failure story?
Well, I guess I don't know if I really have a super big failure in my life, other than, once you're a hit when you're 16, 17 years old, and by the time you're 18, the Beatles took everybody off the charts. That was probably led to some difficult times, because once you've been on top, number one, where do you go?
Yes, that's right.
And so probably from 1966 until about 1971, probably was floundering, trying to find out who I was and that kind of thing. But I was never really lost, because I'm also a mechanic. I can fix cars because my dad taught me to do that when I was a kid. And so I got into auto mechanics and that kind of thing, and got into teaching automotive at community college. So I had to kind of find a way to stay competent at something I love to do, although I kept playing music, and I've done exactly what we're doing here. I've done interviews every year of my life since I've been 15, So I've kind of just gone through those things, and I guess probably at one point I really wanted to get back into music in 1971. It seemed like things were starting to change a little bit. There were more groups coming out that were not Beatlesque necessarily, but more contemporary bands had started. American music had started coming back. And a friend of mine, I don't know if you know Chuck Girard, the Castells. Anyway, Chuck Girard called me one night, said, "Hey, Bob, I'm going to come out to California." He was living in Texas. Anyway, he says, "I want you to meet my new wife." And so he came out to the Long Beach Auditorium and was doing a concert. And I thought I was going to show up and see the Castells and sort of doo-wop, and he was really into Beach Boys. He's Chuck Girard and Joe Kelly were two guys that did background singing on our later albums. And they always did the oohs and the ahs and stuff like that, and Ron Wilson would sing lead. Anyway, Chuck came out, and it turns out to be a Jesus concert. And so I didn't know that's what it was. And so Chuck Smith, who's was the head pastor at Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa, comes out and says, "Taste and see, the Lord is good." And for some reason, something grabbed me by the throat, and I grabbed my wife and my son Devin, and we went forward and accepted Jesus Christ.
Oh, I'll be darned.
And so it was a case where I had said, I really wanted to get back into music, and so we went forward, and I went backstage and talked to Chuck and the guys, and I said, "Hey, I'd really like to get back into music." And they said, "Well, we know this band. It's called Blessed Hope. They need a bass player." Well, I was a guitar player, but I said, "Hey, I can play bass. what's tough, you know? So I grabbed a bass and started playing music again. And so I started playing what's known as worship music today, like Hillsong and those kinds of guys. They have all these original Christian songs, worship songs. And I started playing music. And it was the greatest feeling I'd had in years.
I'll be done.
Because suddenly it was a spiritual-led music. It wasn't just strictly for the money, not for... In fact, we only made like a couple of bucks to play, or nothing. So we would go around and play, and just... It was kind of like a cathartic, you know, just... I needed to do this to get back into music. And that led me to start playing Wipeout again.
Okay.
Because nobody really wanted to hear surf music, per se. And so so we're playing probably for 3 or 4 years, doing these kinds of things, and my wife and I started writing songs, and my wife started writing songs, and she's a concert violinist. And so after years and years, I started going back and forth in 1990, so a long ways going past. Before that, in 1986, we started a punk band.
Oh,
and we
really?
started playing Wipeout in the punk bed, and plus all these songs that my wife had written. And so we put these songs together, and then suddenly we get a call from a friend of ours in 1990 to come to Europe and play. There was about 12 of us in a group, and we toured Europe, Gene and I, and we brought our 17-year-old son, Joel, at that time, and he was really into rap music. We wrote some rap songs. So we're playing Wipeout, rap songs, Christian worship songs, anything we could do to make this group work. And came back in 1990, and I was working for Isuzu Truck of America, which is one of the truck companies, as a technical trainer, because I'd been teaching automotive, and they had some flatbed trucks, and the 75th anniversary of Seal Beach was coming up, and we were living at Seal Beach at the time. And so I got a flatbed truck, and we got on the back of this flatbed truck with all my musical equipment that I'd collected, and we started playing Wipeout at the beginning of the parade. And every time we drive by people, they would all stand up and cheer.
Oh.
You know?
Yeah.
It was just something. It was a special time. And so at the time we got to the end of the parade route, they said, hey, why don't you guys park at the end of the parade and serenade everybody as they walk past, you know, go to their cars and stuff. So we started playing surf music again. And people loved it. They hung around and started talking to us and said, hey, you guys could do some concerts, you know. And so I decided at that point to put a band together. So 1990, started playing surf music regularly at different concerts, but not 100% because I was still working. I didn't want to go on tours and do stuff like that necessarily, but we played some great concerts over the next 10 years. And so in 2000, my two sons, Devin and Joel, who Devin is now my guitar player and Joel is my drummer, and my wife Jean is my bass player. So we put together the amazing Berryhill's Surfaris, and we started playing since 2000, so it's been 17 years now.
You know what? I'm looking at on my laptop. I was Googling the Surfaris, and the Google page comes up. There is a photo on the Google page, not on your website. It's on the Google page of the Surfaris. There's a woman in the photo. Is that your wife?
That's Jean, yeah.
Okay. All right,
yeah.
I got it. And
well, you know, and back in those days, there weren't too many women bass players. What happened was that we had a bass player, another bass player, and another drummer, but they said, well, you guys play too fast. We're going to have to quit. So my son, Devin and Joel, at that point in 2000, said, hey, we'll play. So, because they had been playing on their own with other bands. And so we put ourselves together as a really tight unit. And so this June 14th, 15th, and 16th this year, we're going to be playing with the Ventures.
Oh, boy.
Okay? They've reconstituted their group. So we're going to play the San Diego Fair on the 15th. On the 16th, we're playing at Don the Beachcomber in Sunset Beach, which is near Huntington, Seal Beach. And then on the 17th, Saturday night, we're going to play at the Malibu Inn, which has a club there on the beach. So we got 3 days of waves, we're calling it.
I'm looking at the cover page. It says 3 days of waves, the Ventures, and the Surfaris.
It's going to be a night of instrumental surf music.
Okay, that's great. That is great. I think you will sell them out, if you haven't already.
I've been working on this, believe it or not, for about 3 years.
And the Ventures, is that Walk Don't Run?
Walk Don't Run, Hawaii 5-0.
Right, that's right, Hawaii 5-0.
And they do a great job of Caravan. what's great about it, it's going to be a spectrum from 1958 to 1968, that whole 10-year period where we were all producing songs, and they're going to be, we're not going to repeat one song twice. They aren't going to play Wipeout, we're not going to play Walk Don't Run. So anyway, so we're all going to play, they're going to do their whole instrumental thing, we're going to do our whole instrumental thing, and give the people what it really sounded like, let's say 1963. What did it sound like? And we're going to play it that way. Because we don't do, well, Dick Dale's still out there playing. I don't know if you've seen Dick.
No, I haven't.
Well, he kind of does a collage of things. He'll kind of play about 2 seconds of the Wedge and then go into Miser Lou. I mean, it's kind of rams things together. But we're going to play them as actual songs. We're not going to cut it and go, okay, well, that was enough of that because you're tired of that already. We're going to play it as if it's a great song.
Have your musical taste changed since those days? What kind of music you listen to now?
Well, it's an interesting thing because I started basically with instrumental music in the country area, and then basically switched to when Duane Eddy and the Ventures and those kind of guys. I kind of switched to that kind because I always hear the guitars. That's what I hear when I hear a song. I listen for what the guitar is doing. And then basically rock and roll, that kind of thing, and then kind of moved along. And right now, for the last couple of years, I've been going to Nashville quite a bit. I've got some friends that are professionals back there and do all the session work. Talk to Duane Eddy. In fact, I went to his 79th birthday party at there's a musician's museum that's run by a guy named Joe Chambers. But if you haven't been to that, it's amazing. It's a new museum.
It's in Nashville?
It's in Nashville.
Yeah.
It's at the old municipal auditorium. In the basement, they have a whole area down there. They've turned it into a musician's museum, and it's for the guys like the Wrecking Crew and all of the guys who played everything that was done. Like I say, all the guys that played on your records and stuff, their equipment is there, and the stories. And I've got Wipeout. I've got my original reverb unit that I recorded Wipeout with. That's there in the museum.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah, it's a great museum.
We've been talking about the 60s all along. Do you, and I'm sure all of us, note the differences between today and the 60s? Is there anything that stands out for you today that's totally different than what we were doing back in the 60s?
Well, I guess technology.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about this the other day. In the 60s, with the Tom Hanks movie, That Thing You Do, where you had to be discovered by a nice guy in a camper, and then signed. Today, you can just go on Facebook and iTunes and all of that, like Justin Bieber. He came on the scene and made himself into a star. Well, you couldn't do that back in the 60s.
No way. Yeah.
No way. There was no way to do it. I mean, like you say, you guys were told, hey, these guys are playing your instruments. You didn't get it for a long time. Well, we started out doing our own stuff, and then towards the end, they started bringing people in because we had Gary Usher, who was our producer. He was the guy who helped write 409 for the Beach Boys.
Sure, yeah.
He was in there. He was our producer at Decca Records. And they brought him in to give us a new sound. Well, the new sound turned out to be the Beach Boys sound. That's what he wanted to do.
Okay, yeah.
So, he came in, and so he brought Chuck Girard and those guys in, and Bill Cooper, Richie Podler. These guys are kind of the Wrecking Crew types of guys. And they came in, suddenly we'd show up at a session, and there would be the charts, and he'd had all these songs for us to play, and we go, we don't like these songs. Well, that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
So we would play it, and then we'd be on tour, and he'd finish the album for you, and have Ronnie come down and sing a lead. That's about it, So those kind of things. But I guess the music business is now, like, for instance, I have, these CDs that you're seeing on our website. I self-produce those and have those on TuneCore and iTunes. And so I kind of get to work now as my own publisher, my own record company, independent.
Yeah, I would think that's kind of nice, actually. As long as there's a few bucks there, I would think it's kind of nice.
It is. And, like I said, I re-recorded Wipeout, and so I've got my own version of Wipeout out there, and Surfer Joe. That's my son Joel singing Surfer Joe.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so that's my two sons and my wife and I. And then we, like say, the Wipeout album, re-recorded that, and then we added 10 original songs. And why that's important is because after we did Wipeout and Surfer Joe, Dot came to us and said, hey, we need an album to support your 245s that you got out there? And we said, sure. So we went back to Cucamonga and recorded the 10 songs that are on the Wipeout album in one day. Now, how much fun would that be, right? And then 2 weeks later, the album came out. And in 1963, I don't think you could produce a record in 2 weeks. So what had happened is that Richard Delvey and Associates went down to Hollywood and recorded all the other songs for us. So the album has their group, got friends of his, to actually, and then our manager brings us the album and puts it on my stereo in my house, and he starts playing it, and they go, Wipeout and Surfer Joe, which is us.
Right.
And then he started playing the other songs, and Ron Wilson, who was older than me, he was 2 years older, he says, I don't think that's me playing on the drums. And then, Fuller goes, well, I don't think that's me playing the, well, it isn't me. And then so we asked our manager, and he goes, well, they overdubbed you a little bit because you're not union musician. Good excuse. So that started the lawsuit that I mentioned.
Okay, all right.
And so we, when you're only 16, things called Jackie Coogan laws.
Okay, yes, vaguely, that sounds familiar, yeah.
Well, it's what keeps all of these kids that are like Michael Jackson to be able to keep their money until they get to be 18. Because if you didn't have that, like him, Jackie Coogan was one of the original East Side kids, Little Rascals.
Okay, yes.
And so the money was then put in trust funds for us until we got married or until we became 18. And without that, we wouldn't have made any money. But anyway, so we got thrown off at DOT because, fraud was what our attorneys claimed occurred, because our parents didn't like the idea of a record being out there saying it was the Surfaris with pictures on it, and it wasn't us playing it, other than Wipeout and Surfer Joe. And so if you look at the album, it says on the bottom of the Wipeout album, other songs done by other instrumental musicians. So they had to do that. Yeah, those are details anyway.
Yeah, I know you're working in about 3 weeks. What goes on after that then for the rest of the year?
Well, basically, I retired from teaching. I taught automotive for about 25 years at 2 or 3 community colleges here in Southern California, so I retired from that. And I'm running the publishing and our iTunes and working with agents. My 2 sons run the websites. My wife also contributes to that and does a lot of designing, like the logo, the big S that's got a surfer in it. Anyway, we're getting those little charms made up. We're going to be selling those at our concerts. We do T-shirts, mail order. I do that. Plus, I go to the gym a lot. I think one of your questions was, you're getting older. Well, I go to the gym 3 days a week.
Yes, that's good. Good for you that you're doing it.
Yeah, so I just turned 70 this year.
Okay.
So I figure I got another 10 years in me. So I'm continuing to work hard on staying in shape, and I have a Pro Tools recording system here at my house, and so I just finished about 6 songs that I've been writing, so I'm going to be working on those, putting a new CD together, and so musically we're doing great. My 2 sons both write songs, and so does my wife, and so we're putting together new tunes. So basically I'm going back to do what I did when I was 15, to become a musician. I'm just using my own equipment here at Pro Tools, and I'm becoming basically a recording engineer, doing my own recording, and then we'll go into the studio and finish it up.
It sounds like you are having a good time right now.
I am having a great time. I mean, I love it. I live here at the beach, looking at the ocean right now as we speak. Between my wife and my 2 sons and myself, we've worked hard to gather up our resources and continue the quality of surf music and the surf life. I'm currently writing a book about the safaris, and I've been starting to collect all that. I've got the memorabilia market cornered for the safaris. I've got like 17 photo albums with stuff in it that I'm going to put together and release. So
it almost feels like that we have only kind of just tapped the surface, actually. So, but thank you so much for all of the great info, and I'm going to stay on top of what you guys are doing. All right, well, thank you again. It's been a spectacular hour talking about a lot of good stuff, and I will be in touch in the future.
Okay. Good talking to you, Dick.
Okay, you take care.
Okay, surf's up.
All right, good. I'm going.
All right.
Yeah. Bye-bye. until next week, keep your face in a smile that makes everything worthwhile. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to America's Oldies But Goodies with Dick Scapatoni. Join us again next week for more memories from the good old days. In the words of Jerry Garcia, what a long, strange trip it was. The swingin' 60s. I'm John Berg. See you then.